Jack Johnson was born John Arthur Johnson in 1878 in Galveston, Texas. He was a professional boxer who was nicknamed the Galveston Giant. At the height of the Jim Crow era, he became the first Black American world heavyweight boxing champion. While in his adolescence, instead of attending school, he went to work to help support his family. He took a number of various odd jobs. Eventually, he vagabonded to Dallas to find work and apprenticed to a man who painted carriages. The shop owner, Walter Lewis, introduced Jack Johnson to boxing, and there was no turning back. He was good at beating his opponents, and unfortunately, he was good at beating women too. We'll get there. When Jack Johnson became the world heavyweight boxing champion in 1908, the day after Christmas, he accomplished a feat that a Black man never had. But, to be fair and honest, 6 years before Jack Johnson won his title, another Black man had already won a world boxing title. That man was Joe Gans. But his was in the lightweight class, and from his first title win in 1902 through 1908, he reigned continuously as the lightweight boxing champ of the world. I just had to add that distinction because I think that it's important to be very clear when talking about the first person to accomplish something. But back to Jack Johnson, the first Black heavyweight boxing champion of the world. He loved having that distinction from other Black men, and he also loved having the distinction of being able to flaunt his white girlfriends and wives in front of anyone who would look at him, something that other Black men just could not do. In this video, we're going to take a chronological look at the women who were in Jack Johnson's life and in his bed, and how his relationship with one of them earned him another first Black man distinction. Jack Johnson was the first Black man and the first person altogether to be convicted under the Mann Act because of his relationship with a white teenage girl whose mother was having no parts of it. But by the end of this video, you will know some information on the woman who had a sexual relationship with Jack Johnson, then she got a lot of money from Jack Johnson, and then she became the prosecution's key witness against Jack Johnson as he stood trial for the Mann Act violations. Let's get into it. But first, if you like these videos about your favorite and most scandalous celebrities from yesteryear, subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you can know every time that I upload one of these videos or every time that I live stream. Now, on to why you are here. Woman number 1, Mary Austin. Jack Johnson's first Mrs. Jack Johnson on record was Mary Austin. I don't have a photo of her, nor do I have some photos of some of Jack Johnson's other wives and girlfriends. As this video plays, you will see the photos of the women who had photos on file somewhere. Please just keep in mind that we are starting at 1898, and for most people in the United States at that time, taking photos was a luxury. In the early 1900s, it wasn't uncommon for most people to have had no professional photos taken of themselves or just one photograph taken their whole lifetime. Back to Mary Austin. According to Johnson's 1927 autobiography, My Life in Battles, he married Mary Austin, a Black girl from Galveston, Texas, in 1898. No record exists of their marriage, and the 1900 census shows him still living at home with his parents and siblings. But Jack Johnson was prone to exaggeration, and he would call almost any woman who was sleeping with him Mrs. Johnson. Although they were most likely never legally married, Jack Johnson introduced Mary Austin as his wife wherever he went. She was the first, quote-unquote, Mrs. Jack Johnson, but she definitely was not the last. When Jack Johnson moved to California in 1901, Mary Austin went with him. But after he returned from a training visit to Colorado in 1902, she stayed behind. There was no legal record or talk of a divorce between this couple, which leads me to further believe that even when Jack Johnson didn't legally marry a woman, If she was his favorite woman at that time, he would just call her Mrs. Johnson and announce her as Mrs. Johnson in public. Woman number 2, Clara K. While he was living in Philadelphia during the summer of 1903, Jack Johnson met a black woman, Clara K., at a North Philadelphia brothel. Yes, she was a prostitute. Just a few months later, in September of the same year, she traveled with him to Bakersfield, California, and was his companion for the greater part of the next 3 years. Then, in 1906, she ran off with an old friend of Jack Johnson's, a racehorse trainer named William Bryant. She took most of Jack Johnson's jewelry and even his clothing. Jack Johnson tracked down Clara and his friend William. They were living in Tucson, Arizona. Jack Johnson had Clara K. arrested on burglary charges, and rightfully so. But Jack Johnson forgave her and became romantically involved with her again. Wow, she must have had some really good cornbread. Anyway, the couple moved to California, but Jack Johnson started having trouble finding money-making fights. And when his money ran out, Clara K. left him again, this time for good. Woman number 3, Alma Lola Toy. During a 3-month tour of Australia in early 1907, Jack Johnson had a brief romance with Alma Lola Toy, a 20-year-old white woman from Sydney. Their relationship caused a scandal in the sporting world, so much so that Alma Toy won a 500-pound libel judgment from the Sunday Times newspaper company for an article printed about her relationship with Jack Johnson, published in its sporting paper called The Referee. This was a brief romance, even for Jack Johnson, who was known to bounce from woman to woman. But even though it was short, it was apparently life-changing for him, because after this relationship, he had an epiphany. Being with Alma Lola Toy led Jack Johnson to the striking realization that he needed to renounce black women altogether. White women only. Yes, after returning from Australia, Jack Johnson began traveling with white women exclusively. This is what he said about his decision in his own words in his autobiography. Quote, "The heartaches which Mary Austin and Clara K. caused me led me to forswear colored women and to determine that my lot henceforth would be cast only with white women." End quote. Now, in actuality, he forswore no one. He continued to pursue both black women and white women for the rest of his life, but from that point on, he would only give white women the title of Mrs. Jack Johnson, whether that title came along with a legal marriage or not. He would still sleep with black women, but he made it very clear that white women were his preference. Woman number 4, Hattie Mlay. Jack Johnson met the next Mrs. Jack Johnson on August 8, 1907. Hattie Mlay, whose real name was Anna Peterson, was also a prostitute, working in a whorehouse in Manhattan. She quickly became Jack Johnson's most frequent traveling companion, but their travels together were not happy-go-lucky all of the time. Soon, Hattie Mlay learned that the world was not ready for a white Mrs. Jack Johnson. Upon returning to North America after the Tommy Burns fight in Sydney, Australia, the finest hotel in Victoria, British Columbia, refused a room to Jack and Hattie. And Jack Johnson's hometown of Galveston, Texas, canceled a homecoming parade that was planned for Jack after it was made known that he was traveling back home with a white woman. Hattie Mlay ended up losing her Mrs. Jack Johnson title to his next 2 women. I say the next 2 women because she continued to be his second choice to his next girlfriend and his first official wife. Yes, she hung on for a while and got as much as she could for as long as she could. When Jack Johnson and Hattie Mlay finally parted company in February 1911, he paid her $500 for the return of all of his letters and telegrams. and that $500 in 1911 had the same buying power as $14,000 does today. Woman number 5, Belle Schreiber. In March 1909, Jack Johnson visited the Everly Club, an exclusive all-white whorehouse in Chicago's Levee District. You might be thinking, how did Jack Johnson get into an exclusive all-white anything? Anyone can see that he's not white. Well, he had to be escorted onto the property by his manager, George Little, who was a white man. Without George Little, Jack Johnson would have had access to nothing, not even his prize-winning fights. Jack Johnson was a rich black man with no power. White managers and promoters had to allow him to earn every dime he had. They couldn't claim to own Jack Johnson's talent that helped him win fights, but they held the keys to everything that he was able to access. Even his manager, George Little, had to give Jack Johnson access to his degeneracy in this instance, and he did. Jack Johnson, who had desired entry into this brothel for months, didn't have the permission to do more than just look around. But he did convince 5 of the prostitutes to go for a ride with him in his car. One of those prostitutes was named Belle Schreiber. She was the 23-year-old daughter of a Milwaukee policeman. She came to Chicago to do secretarial work. But once she saw what the city had to offer, being a good-time girl seemed like a much better fit for her. The madams at the Everly Club fired Belle Schreiber after she slept with Jack Johnson. At least 4 other prostitutes were fired for doing the same thing. But in Belle Schreiber's mind, getting fired from the whorehouse might have been just what she needed, because she was soon Jack Johnson's new favorite whore. She was living the life of a good-time girl, traveling with all expenses paid, plus, as she said, a little over to have in my pocketbook. But after Jack's next favorite entered into the picture in the fall of 1909, Belle Schreiber was soon relegated to second-tier status. What a short run she had as his favorite. Not even a full year. Belle left Jack twice after he became physically violent with her on 2 separate occasions. After Jack Johnson left her, she had trouble finding other work, even as a prostitute. Madams fired her, or even refused to hire her in the first place because she had degraded and tarnished herself by sleeping with a black man. Even though Jack Johnson was rich and famous, Belle's association with him as her lover only lowered her social status. Even as a lowly prostitute, having been with Jack Johnson made her even lower. Perhaps in an effort to pay her back for ruining her career, if you want to call it that, in October of 1910, Jack Johnson helped her open her own whorehouse. He wired money to Belle for train fare from Pittsburgh to Chicago, then paid the first month's rent on the building, and then bought all of the furniture for her very own brothel. But 2 years later, federal investigators tracked down Belle Schreiber to a whorehouse in Washington, D.C., and she became the prosecution's chief witness in Jack Johnson's Mann Act trial. My. Woman number 6, ETA Terry Duer. In October of 1909, while he was attending the Vanderbilt Cup car race on Long Island, Jack Johnson met 28-year-old Brooklyn socialite ETA Duer. She was glamorous and very well educated. In that regard, she was the total opposite of every woman Jack Johnson had been with before. She was also prone to depression. 2 years before meeting Jack, she had separated from her husband, Clarence Duer, a millionaire of New York, who was the first manufacturer of gasoline-powered cars in the United States. When she was ready to start dating again, ETA Duer settled on being with Jack Johnson, and she quickly became his new favorite woman, as well as a laughingstock of high society. Belle Schreiber and Hattie Mlay resented her, afraid that they would soon lose their places in Jack's life. Yes, when ETA started seeing Jack Johnson, Belle and Hattie were both still sexually involved with him too. You can recall from part 1, Hattie Mlay was woman number 4 for Jack Johnson. She stayed around to play second fiddle to his woman number 5, Belle Schreiber, and this woman, number 6, Etta Duer. Hattie, woman number 4, didn't stop seeing Jack for good until February 1911. So yes, there's a lot of overlapping in these relationships in case you were trying to keep the dates straight. As for Belle Schreiber, woman number 5, there was at least a year of her relationship with Jack Johnson overlapping into his relationship with woman number 6, aka Etta Duer also. But even with Hattie Mlay and Belle Schreiber in the background, Jack Johnson went forward with pursuing Etta. As he had done with his favorites before, he gave Etta the title of Mrs. Jack Johnson. But he went a step further. This time, Mrs. Jack Johnson wasn't just a title for Etta Duer given by Jack. This time, for the first time with any woman, he made it official with a real legal proceeding. Jack Johnson made Etta his lawful wife on January 18, 1911. As most women would think, Etta Duer thought that being a wife would come with some privileges, one being faithfulness from her husband. She wanted sexual loyalty from Jack Johnson, but very soon she learned that she would have to settle for just getting treated slightly better than his other women. Etta Duer learned that Jack just didn't have it in himself to be faithful. She couldn't bear the constant infidelity and abusive behavior from him, nor the reactions that she received from the general public and her family and friends about being with him. Everyone thought that she was crazy for being with a black man, but to add to it that he was severely mistreating her, she began to feel that he wasn't worth it. Her bouts of depression started to come more frequently and hit more heavily. Just 1 month before the couple got married, in December of 1910, Jack Johnson began to suspect Etta of having an affair with his chauffeur, so he hired a private investigator to have her followed. None of the sources that I found confirmed that she was cheating on him or that she even admitted to having an affair. But on Christmas Day, Jack Johnson confronted Etta Duer at the Pekin Theater in Chicago. He beat her so badly that she had to be hospitalized. She couldn't walk after he attacked her, so he had to carry her to a car. He was so afraid of getting caught and charged for his violence that he asked someone else to drive her to the nearest hospital, Washington Park Hospital. He was such a coward that he sent a friend of his into Etta Duer's hospital room to beg her to not report him for the assault. And she didn't. Etta was in the hospital for several days following Jack's attack. One source that based its information on Jack Johnson's Mann Act trial court documents strongly suggests that during Etta's hospital stay, he took his former favorite prostitute, Belle Schreiber, to the hospital with him to visit his wife, Etta. Not because he needed moral support, but to show Belle the cautionary tale that was his wife. His message was loud and clear. If you don't do as I say, you can end up like this too. Belle Schreiber said that she knew Jack Johnson to be violent, but she never knew just what he was capable of until she saw his wife's face looking, quote, lumpy, like a sack of potatoes, end quote. If she were to sass Jack Johnson, she'd find herself in a similar condition. 10-4. Somehow, after all of this, the couple made up and got back together. They concocted a story about Etta's injuries so that Jack wouldn't have to take responsibility for beating her. They decided to say that she was injured by falling from a streetcar. Less than 3 weeks after her severe beating, they were quietly married in Pittsburgh. Their situation seemed stable for a while. You might recall that Jack Johnson had helped Belle Schreiber go into business for herself, and he'd paid Hattie Mlay that $500 for his letters and telegrams. He didn't do that because those letters had sentimental value to him. He paid her so that she wouldn't give his letters to the press and make his private affairs public. He needed Hattie, and frankly Belle also, to be out of his life, or at least quiet, so that he could hang on to his wife. Almost exactly 1 year after Jack Johnson married Etta Duer, tragedy struck in her family when her father died. Very shortly thereafter, news of her marriage to Jack made its way back to Brooklyn. The people who she once called friends and even family disowned her for lowering herself by being with a black man like Jack Johnson. Her circle of New York City socialites didn't understand how she could have gone from being the wife of a respected white millionaire to being one of many women for a black man who was ridiculed in newspapers across the nation. Headlines called him a demon, a black animal, carefree as a plantation darky in watermelon times, and a Texas watermelon pickaninny. Many sports writers called him names that were even worse than that. But this was her husband, and the people who she thought loved her deserted her for that fact. Her depression deepened even further over the following months, and she attempted ending her life twice. On September 11th, Jack tried to send her on a vacation to Las Vegas with a friend. It was supposed to be a bit of a mental health break and a time for her to relax and reset. But at the last minute, she said that she wasn't feeling well enough to go. Jack ran to the train station to change the tickets and returned to his nightclub, the Café de Champion, to find Etta Duer dying of a self-inflicted gunshot wound in their upstairs apartment. One source says that her final written words were, quote, "I am a white woman, and all my misery comes from marrying a black man. Even black people despise me. I intend to end it all." End quote. Woman number 7, Lucille Cameron. They said, "You can't turn a whore into a housewife." Jack Johnson said, "I'm going to give it my best try." In the summer of 1912, Jack Johnson met Lucille Cameron, an 18-year-old prostitute from Milwaukee, when she visited his Café de Champion with a friend. He was sexually involved with her almost as soon as he met her. Keep in mind the timeline. Etta Duer, his first wife, took her life in September of 1912, and he met and started a relationship with Lucille Cameron in the summer of 1912. So, just a couple of months before his wife ended her life, he was already seeing this woman. It kind of makes you wonder if the Las Vegas vacation that he had planned for his wife wasn't really to give her a mental break, but just to give him some time alone with his new favorite whore. Nevertheless, in order to cover up his relationship with her, Jack hired Lucille as his secretary. But only 2 weeks after Etta Duer's death, Lucille Cameron was going out in public on Jack Johnson's arm. In October, keep in mind this is literally the next month after his wife died, Lucille Cameron's mother went to the police and charged Jack Johnson with kidnapping her daughter. She told the press, quote, "Jack Johnson has hypnotic powers, and he has exercised them on my little girl. I would rather see my daughter spend the rest of her life in an insane asylum than see her the plaything of a nigger." End quote. Days later, on October 18th, Jack Johnson was arrested for violating the Mann Act. But Lucille Cameron refused to cooperate with authorities, and the case fell apart. Less than a month later, Jack Johnson was arrested again on Mann Act charges. It is important to explain here that the Mann Act in 1912 wasn't exactly the same as it is today. Back then, it was the White Slave Traffic Act. It prohibited white slavery and the interstate transport of females for immoral purposes. So basically, Jack Johnson was arrested for driving prostitutes from one state to the next and having sex with them. On December 4th, less than 3 months after Duer took her life, Jack Johnson and Lucille Cameron were married, and the public was outraged. After his Mann Act conviction in June of 1913, Jack skipped bail. He ran away to Montreal, arriving on June 25th, where Lucille was waiting for him. For the next 7 years, they lived in exile, globe-trotting to Europe, South America, and Mexico, until he surrendered to authorities on July 20th, 1920. When Jack Johnson was released from the federal prison at Leavenworth, Kansas, on July 9, 1920, Lucille was waiting for him. 4 years later, she filed for divorce on the uncontested charge of infidelity. No surprises there. Woman number 8, Irene Pino. The autumn after his divorce from Lucille Cameron was finalized, Jack Johnson met 2 middle-aged women, Irene Pino and Helen Matthews, at a racetrack in Aurora, Illinois. The following February, Irene divorced her husband, and she and her friend Helen Matthews both began seeing Jack Johnson together. As Irene spoke about this too-close-for-comfort threesome in her own words, quote, "Miss Matthews and I became quite friendly with Mr. Johnson, and our friendship progressed rapidly until it became an issue as to which one of us he liked best. It so happened that I was the favorite one." End quote. So much for girl code. Irene Pino emerged as Jack Johnson's favorite, ending the threesome with her friend and her man. Jack walked down the aisle one last time when the two were married in Waukegan, Illinois, in August of 1925. Irene was Jack Johnson's wife until death parted them. In June of 1946, Jack was speeding and caused an automobile accident that killed him. Irene handled his final arrangements. She buried him in Chicago in a grave next to his first wife, Etta Duer. I can only imagine that made Etta turn over in her grave or want to rise from the dead and ask the manager at the cemetery to move her gravesite or his. Maybe that's just me. What are your thoughts? How do you think Etta Duer would have felt about being buried next to her physically abusive, cheating husband? Please comment below. I'd love to see what you all think. Take notice of how differently their headstones are worded. She is to be remembered as his wife, someone who belonged to him. He is remembered for his career, not as her loving husband. Just an observation. Now, those are all of the wives and girlfriends who Jack Johnson had on public record, but it's worth mentioning that during one period while Jack Johnson was living in Philadelphia, there were supposedly 5 women claiming to be Mrs. Jack Johnson at the same time. But to be clear, the only 3 legal marriages he had are the ones mentioned in this video. As for Jack Johnson's conviction under the Mann Act, President Donald Trump granted him a pardon posthumously in 2018. Perhaps Trump saw a kindred spirit in Jack Johnson. Let's be clear. Jack Johnson was an important figure to Black people, but Black people were never important to him. And I'm not talking about his dating preferences or being with white women. He was free to date and marry whomever he chose. And frankly, the abuse that he inflicted on his wives shows that he merely saw them as tawdry possessions to flaunt in order to build up his own ego. When I say that Black people were not important to Jack Johnson, I'm talking about the other aspects of his life. For example, he was never even known to help out his fellow Black boxers of his day. He didn't give them any fights. This was a man who was out for himself in every way. This coonish cartoon drawing of Jack Johnson depicts him as a buffoon, animal-like, but also shows Sam Langford in the background, waiting for his chance to fight the champ. Sam Langford was an excellent heavyweight fighter who likely would have been a formidable opponent for Jack Johnson had Jack cared to fight black boxers who may have given him more of a run for his money. Now, I know that there was a lot of overlapping going on in Jack Johnson's relationships. If you like stories about sloppy lovers like this one, you might also enjoy my video about Peggy Hopkins Joyce. She had a lot of lovers and she got everything that she could from them. I'll leave a link to her story in the description box. My sources for this video are My Life in Battles by Jack Johnson, PBS.org, Jack Johnson and the Era of Great White Hopes by Graham Kent, The Victorian Historian, The Transatlantic Magazine, Glint Journal, Irish Times, The Big Smoke by Adrian Matejka, The Pittsburgh Courier, and Unforgivable Blackness, The Rise and Fall of Jack Johnson by Jeffrey C. Ward. This video has been brought to you by me. Well, my Patreon is a sponsor for this video. If you like these dirty scandals on my channel, then you'll love my Patreon, Ty's Too Hot Mess History. It has all of the stuff that I can't talk about or show here because it's just too hot, too violent, too sexual, too graphic, too much. Come and join us there for the hot mess history. The link is in the description box.